Today on the podcast, I look at your questions and offer my answers. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Welcome to the podcast, everybody. So today we have a long overdue podcast, which is our Q&A episode. So we did one of these way back when, and we have been saying to ourselves, boy, we got to work in another one of those Q&A episodes because we are filling up with comments and questions. And on that note, thank you. So thank you for the likes. Thank you for the shares. Thank you for the subscribes. And thank you for all the comments. That all really helps out the algorithm here. And we now have hundreds of comments to sift through, which is a wonderful problem to have. But for that reason, we are long overdue for me to delve into the sorts of comments and questions that you've been asking. And so my producer has dutifully sifted through those comments and questions in order to offer up here. Well, I don't know how many questions I have in front of me, but there's quite a few. So we'll see how many of these I can get through, and how many of those burning questions we can satisfy in this episode. So keep them coming, and we will, as time goes on, we'll probably do like more live stream Q&A type things. There's things a cooking. Right. We've got some ideas of brewing. And so if there's anything you're looking for, if you're sitting there going, boy, I'd really love to have a live stream episode. I'd love to have this or that. Love to hear that stuff. So please put it in the comments. But for now, let's see what we got. These look to be broken up according to episode. These first few comments are actually from the inaugural episode, the most important question. If you haven't listened to that one, I mean, shame on you if you're a listener to this podcast. I mean, not really. But I will just say the most important question, that was very intentionally the first episode because it frames so much of this podcast. So I presume that most listeners, anyone who, this is not your first time stumbling onto this channel, you're familiar with that episode where I go through the history of ideas and I frame it through this lens of realism and nominalism, and offer sort of my take on the most important question, which is the question of realism. And I'm sure we'll touch on that probably some point here in this podcast. We usually do. But that sets up quite well, my perspective on the history of ideas, what I think is sort of the right entry point for most of philosophy. And it provides a rudder for a lot of the topics that we delve into here on the show. So if you haven't listened to that one, you should. Go listen to it and tell your friends, share, do all that sort of stuff. It's good stuff. All right. So let's see. What's our first question here? What is this one? Would it be correct to say that Darwinism is nominalism applied to biology? And therefore, to be a realist, one cannot accept the idea that biological kinds inevitably change into other kinds with enough time? I love this question. Okay, I love this question for a variety of reasons. There's a number of topics. I will probably at some point want to do an entire episode, at least one episode, on evolution, on creation, on things like that. So this is just going to be a teaser because there's a number of different things here. But let me weigh in on this because I love this topic, and I think whoever offered this question, I don't have names on these comments. This is sort of a distilled catalog. But whoever asked this question, good for you. Nice insight. Well done. I actually, on this question, I have quite a few thoughts. I'm probably going to do a full episode at some point on evolution, right? And creation and some of the topics related to that. So obviously I'm not going to devote this isn't going to suddenly devolve. Look at that. It's not going to devolve into an episode that's just on this one question. We have other questions to get to, but let me see how many things I can touch on. Let me first say this. Okay. Just a couple of things. First, I am not actually an advocate of the theory of evolution. Obviously, I believe in microevolution. Everybody does. But, in terms of macroevolution as an explanation of the various species that exist, I am not an advocate of that theory. And yet, the reason is not for theological reasons. I actually think theologically, it could be made perfectly acceptable, and I think even fit quite well, quite nicely within certain aspects of the sort of theology you find in the Eastern Church Fathers. Now, that's only a teaser. I don't think we're actually going to get to that in me addressing this question because that's a bigger topic. But let me just say this. My resistance to evolution is sort of twofold. On the one hand, it is philosophical, and that's probably what I'm going to talk about here, given the nature of the question. And then the other reason is scientific. So admittedly, I am not a scientist, in case you didn't know that. I am a metaphysicist, metaphysician, but I am not a scientist. But, based on my understanding of those scientists that I have read, there are legitimate reasons to question the scientific veracity of the theory. And so this is where I think there are people like Stephen Myers who are quite good on this topic. And I'd point you to somebody more qualified like him to speak on the scientific side of the question. It's on the philosophical side of the question where I think there's other issues that come into play. So I'll start there. So one of the things here, which is what the question seems to recognize, the theory of evolution, just on the face of it, sort of on a sort of prima facie level, the problem I have with it is that basically what it suggests is that compounding accidental properties over time result in changes in essential properties. If I were to reframe the theory. Now, if you know what those terms mean, you immediately understand there's something inherently problematic about it. Because in metaphysics, if you're a realist, right, you have this basic distinction between essential and accidental properties. Let's take, for example, a square. Square has four sides, right? The sides have to be equal length. They have to, run parallel with each other. They have to have right angles, all that sort of stuff. So you have these essential properties that you can't change and still have a square. And then what you have is you have accidental properties. And these are properties that are extrinsic to those essential properties that can change, and they have no bearing whatsoever on whether it's a square. So, for example, where it is, right? It's here, it's over here, it's still a square, right? Size, right? You can have it 1 foot, 20 feet, right? Doesn't matter. It can still be a square. Color, right? That it is blue or red or yellow or whatever. Those are the sorts of things that are accidental. They are extrinsic to the essential properties of the thing. And so they are subject to change, having no bearing whatsoever on the type of thing it is. And so the difficulty that I have with evolution just right from the get-go is that in a very simplistic way, what it suggests is that compounding changes in accidental properties will eventually result in changes in essential properties. But accidental properties, by definition, are things that are subject to change without affecting essential properties. So that right there, I'm already like, well, the formulation is like kind of problematic. How would you actually formulate this? There's a second problem here. And again, these are just, I'm going to catalog things and move through them rather quick. I think there's a certain sleight of hand that happens in the sort of evolutionary narrative that tries to bury a very real problem. And it's a problem related to realism and nominalism. So if we were to, let's say we were trying to demonstrate, using, an animation tactic, how an evolutionary process might work in which a species might develop a new trait of some kind, right? So we do this animation where what we have is we have some sort of like lizard thing, and that lizard thing is tailless. And at some point there starts to be this little bit of a nub, right? Some sort of growth on its back end. And then we start to see offspring. And then with some of those, the nub gets passed on. And with the passing on, as they sort of crossbreed, the nub gets larger. And then what we start to find is that over time, this nub starts to have a certain utility the larger it gets for certain people, either for protection or for balance or for swimming or whatever it may be. And so over time, the ones that actually have this larger growth end up having a greater propensity for survival than the ones that don't. And so over time, the ones that don't have it start to die off, and the crossbreeding compounds it. And so over time, this starts to grow and grow and grow until it becomes a full-blown tail. And now we have, this reptilian thing with a tail. Okay. So in many ways, the sort of animation process, the smooth transitional process of that provides the magic, right? And necessary in order to make that plausible. But that sort of smooth transitional process creates a bit of a problem. The problem is that what we still have is there is a point at which the species is not tailed. We have a species that is not tailed. And then we have a point at which now we have a tailed species. Okay. And the first question we have there is to say, well, are these the same species? And I would say, if you're a realist, like if you're saying that tailed is now an essential property, then clearly you have a new species, right? It is a species that has a lot of overlapping essential properties with the former one that is not tailed, but this one has a tail. Okay, so you have a new species, which means that at some point that new species was produced when tailed became one of its essential properties. Now, the thing is, there is no way to smooth that out. Even though the animation smooths that out and it makes it look like a smooth, clean transition, there is a point where you've got a non-tailed species that has a growth, and now you've got a tailed species that is a totally different species. Now, why is this a problem? Well, this is a problem because even though the sort of animation tactic gives you the impression of, of the evolution, the slow evolution of a new species, what you actually have is you have punctuated evolution. There's a point where now this thing, right, this tail is one of the essential properties and we have a new species. There's no smooth way to make that transition. So the animation tactic sort of like does a sleight of hand where it smooths it over for the observer and makes it plausible. But the fact of the matter is you still have a punctuated leap from one species to another. Punctuated evolution is one of the things that, contemporary evolutionary theory typically does not want to have. It wants to have a smooth transition. A closely related problem is also this, it's a different version of the same problem, that at one point we had a growth. Put aside whether it's an essential or accidental property, right? At one point we had a growth and we were saying it was a growth, it's not a tail, but at some point it becomes a tail. And now this growth, which was not a tail, we're not talking about a small tail that's moving from a potential tail to an actual tail, right? We're not talking about something like this. I can anticipate that somebody would be like, well, that's the beard fallacy, right? What point does a beard become a beard? Well, a beard is still like you're dealing with something that, in potentia, right? You have the potential for a beard and what's growing out is that, right? It's moving from potential to actual. So the underlying nature is consistent. But you're suggesting here in this one where you're saying, well, it's just a growth. It's not a tail. You actually are saying that there is a transition to becoming something else. It's not moving from a potential tail into an actual tail. It's actually becoming a tail. And so in a similar way, this isn't the entire species, but it is a change in species of thing. It's gone from a growth to a tail. And again, there's no smooth way to make that transition. It's going to be punctuated. And once again, like the sort of animation smooths that out. But what you're going to have is you're going to have to affirm some sort of punctuated leap, right? Some sort of moment where this not a tail became a tail. You're going to have to, and same in the corporation, you're going to have to affirm that there is a punctuated leap where at some point we went from a species that did not have a tail as an essential property to one that has a tail as an essential property. Now, here's what I would anticipate. Somebody might look at that and say, well, I think all you've done is you've proven nominalism. Okay. In other words, what they mean is they look at this and they say, well, the very fact that evolution is true, right? They're sort of doing this argument, right? There's two versions of this argument. If realism is true, evolution is false. Realism is true, therefore evolution is false. But they say, no, if realism is true, evolution is false. Evolution is true, therefore realism is false, right? Or realism is true if and only if. Realism is true if and only if evolution is false, right? And so evolution is true, therefore realism is false. You'd have to do something like that, right? So you try to invert it and you say, well, all this really tells us is that we need to be nominalists because obviously evolution is true. Now, here's the problem that I have with that. Again, now this gets to sort of a third philosophical problem. So we had the accidental essential properties problem. We had this sort of this punctuated evolution problem. Punctuated, yeah, I mean, that's what it is. whether you're talking about a tail or the species as a whole. That's punctuated evolution problem. The alternative is that you say, well, let's get rid of realism and let's affirm nominalism. I pointed out in my defense of realism, I think in my episode, The Case for Realism, I think I pointed this out. It's been a minute. But I actually don't think that scientific inquiry actually functions without realism. So this becomes part of the problem, is that I think if you're going to say, well, we get rid of realism, but we keep evolution, you end up actually cutting out the legs of the very scientific evidence that you'd want for evolution. Here's why. So let's take an example of a certain type of argument certain type of inference that you might make from evolution. All right, so you'd say, okay, so we have telomere, and telomere, they're a terminus of a DNA strand, and what we find is that there are certain instances where in some instances what we find is fused telomere. And so what that tells us is that there's fused telomere that indicates that at some point these DNA strands were discrete, they were not unified. And so through some sort of biological process, they've become fused together. And so ergo, some sort of evolutionary change in the species. Okay. The difficulty with that line of inquiry is that it requires realism. Because basically what you're saying is you've identified a species of thing, telomere. This is a telomere. This is a telomere. So that's your formal cause, right? And then what you've also said is that you've identified a final cause or a telos of it, right? A teleological end. Teleological end is kind of redundant, but since telos is an end. But you've identified a telos or an end for which it has, which is that it serves as this terminus. It serves this terminus role in a DNA strand, and therefore, if it's fused, that indicates that these previously were actually separate DNA strands, because here's the terminus and here's the terminus. But the problem is a realist can actually make that inference, right? So we can, as a realist, let's say we're Aristotelian realists. And so we're doing induction and we're looking across, we're taking a sampling to try to identify what the essential properties are. And so in this sense, there is an inductive process about it where we're trying to discern what are the common essential properties and distinguish what is accidental from essential and so on. So there's an inductive process, but if our inferences are correct in terms of determining what the essential processes are, then what we're able to do is we're able to identify a universal. And so having identified a universal, what we're able to do is make what's called an A claim in logic. So in logic, an A claim means all P is Q, right? So it's an all claim, okay? Now, the reason this is important is because in logic, the function of an A claim, all P is Q, is very different than the function of, say, an I claim, some P is Q, right? Because if you're familiar with, this is a very basic tool of logic, but the square of opposition. What you can do is if you have an A claim, right, an all claim, you can start to make inferences regarding the other things, right? If it's true, all P is Q. Then what you have is it's also true that some P is Q, right? It's false that some P is not Q, and it's false that no P is Q, right? So all the other possible claims that are there in the square of opposition, you can answer because you have an A claim. You can do the same thing with the E claim, right? If no P is Q, then it's false that all P is Q. It's false that some P is Q. It's true that some P is not Q. So it works that way. But I claims some P is Q, and O claims some P is not Q. Those some claims only tell you the opposite, right? So if I know that some P is Q, I know it's false that no P is Q. But all, some not, I don't know, right? So an I claim functions, it's the deliverances of an I claim are very different. And we could see this, if you consider the fact, like let's just take the example of all cars are red. If it's true, all cars are red, then I can start to make judgment claims when somebody's like, well, this car is blue. And I'm like, no, it's not, because all cars are red. And so I know it's false that blue is not red. And so, that car can't be blue. But if all I was like is I'm like, well, I know that some cars are red. And then somebody's like, well, I think this car is blue. I'd be like, well, maybe it is. I don't know. Because all I know is that some cars are red. Now, the importance of that is because when you're doing scientific inference, science wishes to function like an Aristotelian. So science wants to move forward in induction and say, well, this thing, this type is a telomere, right? They want to identify a generic nature. And they want to identify this generic nature, telomere, as the same as this other generic nature over here, telomere. So they want to be able to say that that's a telomere and that's a telomere. Okay. So first of all, that's a realist impulse. And then, like an Aristotelian, they want to be able to go ahead and identify the essential properties, right? The essential properties, the accidental properties, and with that also teleological ends, right? So for example, all telomere are termini of DNA strands. And that is what allows them to make a certain inference and say that this is an anomaly, right? Because if the telomere is in the middle and it's fused, then that indicates an anomaly because it's out of step with the common nature. But you can only make that inference if it's an A claim. If you know that all telomere, right, are termini, then you can say that that's an exception. But if all you have is some telomere are termini, then you can't make that inference because you'd be able to say like, well, sometimes they're here and sometimes they're there. You can only actually make that inference if what you've done is abstracted a common nature. And the problem is when it comes to nominalism, you can't do any of it. Right. So with nominalism, you don't even have common natures. Not only can you not make an A claim, right, that, all P is Q, you can't make an A, like it's actually purely nominal. When you say this is a telomere and this is a telomere, that's actually a false sort of statement. There actually isn't any sort of ontological unity between those two types of things. And so all you know is that sometimes I find a thing at the end of what I call a DNA strand that looks kind of like this other thing that I find at the end of another thing of a DNA strand. You can't engage in the kind of inference that they want to, right? So my point is that scientific induction functions in a realist manner. Scientific induction functions very much like an Aristotelian realist. And candidly, I think, unless you are a realist, scientific induction breaks down. So why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because if what we have to do in order to rescue evolution is to get rid of realism, I think what you also get rid of in that is scientific induction. So I understand the impulse that somebody might be like, well, I'm inclined to favor evolution, so I want to get rid of realism in order to try to rescue the theory. But I think the problem is if you get rid of realism, you also get rid of the basis for, scientific induction. Scientific induction becomes fallacious without it because it's just a series of I claims at best, right? At best. And I say at best because without nominalism, you don't even have coherent groups. So again, I'd point you to the most important question. But as I said, right, when you say this is a telomere and this is a telomere, in nominalism, that's just naming, right? There isn't actually an ontological connection. So any sort of inference, you're always just dealing with an instance, right? A completely unique snowflake. See, even that, I can't even speak as a nominalist because you always use general nouns. Snowflake, it's a type of thing. But the point is, yes. So like all of induction, where it's based on groups, right? All P is Q, some P is Q, things like that. Common natures, teleological ends, all that starts to unravel if you're a nominalist. And so for that reason, I think it's a fool's errand to try to hold on to evolution and suggest that scientific induction favors evolution while undercutting realism, right? You get rid of realism. I think you get rid of any sort of rational basis for scientific induction, So, I mean, is there a way of rescuing evolution, in that point? I do think there are certain things that, again, in a full episode, I would explore, for example, the problem of metamorphosis. If you look at Aristotle and the transition from one species, like a caterpillar into a butterfly. But the sort of short version is that as a realist, I think those transitional things are actually sort of woven into the nature of the thing that you're already dealing with. So the one way in which I could see a theory of evolution working would be a philosophy of organism in which the entire cosmos is one giant organism that is just slowly moving from potentiality to actuality. So just like what you see in a fetus, right, where you see the human nature is there and the material is catching up, and the way the material is developing over time is manifesting the underlying nature that is already implicitly there, driving it forward. You could say that the world is a giant cosmic organism, and that part of what you're seeing as what appears to be the evolution of new species is really just sort of the manifestation of all the species that are sort of already in the cosmic DNA, which is unfolding and moving from potentiality to actuality. I think you could say that. But that's not evolution, right? Like that's not evolution in the way that Darwinian evolution is. So anyway, I'm happy to do a full podcast on that topic at some point, and specifically questions related to creation and Genesis and whatever else. But that's sort of my short. Was that short? I don't know that that's a short answer. That's sort of an overview of, or a sampling of some of the things that I'd probably talk about in that context, which gives you a glimpse of my answer to that. I mean, let's see. But the question was, nominalism, right? Is Darwinianism, nominalism applied to biology? I mean, I think there's a yes in there. There's a no there. I think Darwinianism requires nominalism to be true in order for it to function, because you have to be able to say that us identifying a species here, a species there, that we're just sort of naming those. We're sort of arbitrarily creating markers between these transitions, but there is no real species underneath it. It's just change. But as I said, I think you do have the problem that scientific induction requires realism. And so, I think that's a major problem. I think it's a major tension. And so happy to delve into that, and thankful for the question on that one. Okay, what do we got here? Also, most important question: how do those who adopt materialism / utilitarianism, which functionally abolishes free will, still believe in any form of intentionality, like social engineering? I can't understand for the life of me how those who preach the death of free will also seem to believe they've arrived at the conclusion via rational means. Doesn't rationality require free will? Please help me see what I'm missing. Okay, so this is an interesting question. I think Thomas Hobbes is probably a good example of how you can see how a sort of like materialism that really does embrace determinism, understands things like social engineering, right? So somebody like Hobbes definitely wants to say that, look, there's still a sort of functionality to fear and to pain, right? So Hobbes is all for a very scary, intimidating sovereign government. He's all in favor of corporeal punishment, right? Because he thinks this is basically, instills fear and restraint and things like that. So for somebody like Hobbes, it's just like training an animal, right? So Hobbes is not sort of offering you a means by which he thinks like, well, you have contrary choice and there's some sort of free self-determination along those lines. Hobbes is a determinist. But he still sees the usefulness in the fact that by incentivizing, just like with a dog, right? You don't think your dog has free will, presumably, at least. But you still train your dog. You try to incentivize it by rewarding certain behaviors, and you inflict pain with regard to other behaviors. And those pleasure pain sort of reactions end up instilling a certain pattern of behavior. And so social engineering actually makes a lot more sense if you don't believe in free will, right? Free will is kind of a bugaboo. It's a problem if you believe in social engineering, because doggone it, like there's just people still making free choices. It's kind of the matrix problem, right? That there's always a percentage of people who want to rebel against the programming. But from the social engineering perspective, that's actually exactly what it is, right? Having having gotten rid of the free will problem and believing that what really is going on here is some more materialist processes, you start to believe that man is a complex machine, that if you can sort of reverse engineer what's going on in the programming, as it were, that you're able to sort of dissect the ways of manipulating and directing, operations and behaviors the way you would like to see them play out. And so this is exactly why in the sort of materialist utilitarian thing, you developed, sociology and anthropology as a way of observing and analyzing human behavior, specifically because they thought it was machine-like. And so in this way, you could reverse engineer the sort of incentive structures, the sort of behavior patterns, things like that, so that we could figure out how to better manipulate and, quite literally engineer behavior in the direction that they would, like to see it go. So in this sense, I would say that the thing that you might be missing is just the fact that if you really truly believe in free will, free spontaneity, self-determination, things like that, the idea of engineering humanity becomes more problematic. Because you would actually suggest you can try to coerce people, things like that, but there's this underlying will that only the will can sort of move itself, which is a more traditional free will view. But if you actually don't believe that, if you think what we are is really complex meat robots, and we're so complex in our operations that we leave the impression that we're making free, spontaneous choices that could go one way or another, but that's a misimpression. If that's what you think, then you can actually sort of start to hold out the hope that maybe what we can do is we can start to better understand the machine, the patterns of behavior, how to manipulate, how to coerce, how to redirect, and in a sense, engineer human behavior toward a utopia. So that's what's going on there. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything else here in this question. Yes. Okay. So there is this other sort of like wrinkle in this. So they believe they've arrived at the conclusion viewed rational means doesn't rationality require free will. I think what you're observing here is you're really sort of asking a question within your question. So I think the thing that you're trying to ask here, and I think this is the right sort of instinct, is that you're identifying sort of an odd tension within the determinist mind, which is on the one hand, there is this certain, I am operating and functioning as if I have some sort of control over my intellectual processes, and as if those processes are aimed at truth telling, and as if by making certain choices regarding inference or reasoning or induction or whatever it is, I might be able to move myself closer to truth telling or away from, falsehood or something like that. And yet, if I'm really a determinist, then I shouldn't actually believe that's the case, because I don't actually have control over my processes. It's only an appearance of control. I don't actually have a control over the sorts of beliefs I arrive at. I just sort of have them, and so on. And so this is where I think, similar to the way I critiqued, I do think there is an odd tension here. So I forget which episode it was in where I talked about sort of my own epistemological positions. It might have been in my case for realism. I talked about how I'm not, how I am not a hard foundationalist. And then I talked about why I think hard foundationalism and skepticism are both problematic. And they're problematic because the hard foundationalist wants to say, I don't believe anything unless I sort of can get, sort of a clear foundational argument for it, that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, though, hard foundationalism ends up trusting reason. And I talked about that fact that even when you try to doubt everything and you get yourselves into this sort of Cartesian straitjacket, that you still then try to reason your way out of it. If you follow Descartes, right? The first thing I think, therefore I am, right? And so you do this sort of this argument, this sort of basic argument that ends up advocating for the reality of the self. And you say, see, I've got my first premise. But the problem is you're still trusting reason. And if you're really going to engage in the skeptical experiment the way Descartes claims to, you would have to doubt everything, including the functionality of reason. And so that's part of the problem that I have. You'd have to consider, well, maybe I'm a calculator. I'm a broken calculator that always, when you put in 2 + 2, it says equals fluvidity 7, something like that. And so you'd have to do something like that. And I don't think you can get out of that straitjacket. So one of the things that I had pointed out is that I think hard foundationalism is not really functional. At the end of the day, you do end up embracing at least reason. And once you embrace reason, why just embrace the sort of analytic, rational side rather than your empirical faculties and things like that. So I think it's non-functional. Similarly, I talked about the non-functionality of skepticism and how the skeptic falls into a sort of similar sort of error, where on the one hand, it's unlivable, right? The skeptic does go out and still like lives his life, but also the skeptic will try to argue you into skepticism. And yet, that shows some sort of underlying trust in reason and things like that, even though supposedly you're being skeptical about everything. And so I think there is some of these sort of philosophies, I think it's important that there's an underlying coherence and livability to it. And I do think the sort of thing that you're identifying here with the determinists is that there is a similar sort of odd tension as what you find in like a hard foundationalist who supposedly doubts everything, but then, sort of trusts reason. The skeptic who supposedly is skeptical of everything, but then embraces reason, things like that. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm inclined toward a soft foundationalism, where you just accept we have to have first principles. My first principles are that, unless I have very good reason to think otherwise, my faculties are functioning properly and they're aimed at telling me true things about the world. And I start there. But I think there's a similar sort of uneasiness that happens here with determinism, which is what I think you're sensing. Which is that the determinist sort of functions as if they have some sort of control over their cognitive processes, over their beliefs, over their pursuit of truth, and that these things are aimed at truth telling. But if you're really a determinist, why believe that? So I think there's a sort of an underlying problem there. There's something similar that happens in Alvin Plantinga's critique of naturalistic evolution. Since we already had an evolution question. Alvin Plantinga points out that, one of the challenges with a naturalistic concept of evolution is that you have to believe that your rational faculties are sort of emergent out of natural processes, out of evolutionary processes, and that these are unguided, right? That's the naturalistic part, unguided natural, processes that are aimed just at sort of survival. And Plantinga points out that there's no reason to presume that survival is necessarily aimed at truth telling. And so for that reason, if you come to this sort of, conclusion that evolution is true and you don't have God, right? You have a non-theistic naturalistic view of evolution. What you've got is you've got a worldview, your beliefs about evolution that should cause you to question whether or not your faculties are reliable, whether they're aimed at telling you true things about the world. So ironically, right, the belief in evolution ends up undermining your ability to trust your beliefs, right? It undermines the reliability of reason. And so Plantinga suggests the only consistent way to sort of epistemically consistent way to coherently hold that would be that you would be a theistic evolutionist, where you would suggest that, well, perhaps God is the one ordering these processes, and in ordering these processes, they're aimed at bringing about beings who have faculties that tell them true things about the world. That would be the only way for that to be coherent. So all that's to say is, I think you're right that there are some odd tensions within determinism, where some of its confidence in its beliefs about determinism should maybe be shaken by its determinism. So anyway, okay, next question. This is the last one under most important question. So what is this one? How would philosophical realism apply to adoption? Well, would it classify an adopted child as a second-class family member because they are not from a substance of the parents? Nominalism would seem more amenable to making someone a family member by simply treating them like it or by fiat. Okay, I don't know if the person who asked this question knows this, but I actually have an adopted son, Bojidar. So if you've ever seen my documentary, Becoming Truly Human, the one on the religiously unaffiliated, or the nuns, I actually share the story of Bojidar. So Bojidar, he's from Bulgaria, and he's Bulgarian. Specifically, he's Roma, right? So he's a gypsy. And we adopted him when he was 7 years old, and he was horribly treated, severely neglected, on the verge of starvation when we adopted him. 7 years old, only 20 pounds, couldn't walk, couldn't talk. Lots and lots of trauma there. And candidly, there's, barring a miracle, which could happen, barring a miracle, it looks to be permanent damage. No genetic reason for it, right? He's highly delayed cognitively. But there's no genetic reason for that. It does seem to be just sort of institutional neglect, that there's permanent brain damage. And you can also tell that like he should be a lot taller than he is, right? His body started growing exceedingly fast when we started feeding him and caring for him properly. But, it never really caught up, to where it was supposed to be. You can tell, look at his hands and his feet. You're like, that dude should be bigger. So anyway, that's Bojidar. I love him. I adore him. He's my son. And he knows that. Now, to this question, the fact of the matter is that, yes, is Bojidar my biological son? No, he's not. Okay. There is a very real and substantial difference between my relationship to Bojidar and my relationship to David. David is my son, right? My biological son. And so, whether you're talking about from a realist perspective, or you're even just talking from a biological perspective, the fact of the matter is that David is an extension of my own substance, right? And that is a very real thing, whereas Bojidar is not. And so when we're talking about this from a realist perspective, these relations are real. From a biological perspective, they're real too. But from a realist perspective, what we're talking about here is what might be called the difference between, say, it's essential accidental properties, but what's sometimes called internal-external relations, when you move into relationships of this sort of thing. So internal relations are relations that are essential to the identity of the subject. External are accidental to it, right? So in this sense, what we see is, if we look at David, it is an essential property of David, right? It is essential to him, an internal relation, that he is my son, right? And in other words, he would not be David if he were not my son. And here I'm divulging certain positions that I have in terms of my understanding of individual identity. I do not think identity is a repeatable, universal. I don't think there's such a thing as Davidness that David has that we could give to somebody else, because then you would end up with the obvious absurdity that you could have two people who are the same person because they share in a common universal. So I don't actually believe that identity is a universal, that it's a form in that way. And so I do understand his identity to be wrapped up in some of those particularities, including the particularities of him being my son. So for him, it's an essential property. He would not be David without that. The same is not true of Bojidar, right? So granting free will and contrary possibilities, and then what we would have to say is that it is entirely possible that Bojidar could have been born to his parents, and that his parents did not choose to give him up for adoption, and he would have been raised by them, and he would have never come to know me, and he would not be my son, right? That is a very real possibility, and Bojidar would still be Bojidar. The same cannot be said of David. And so there is a more real, substantial tether there in terms of my relationship with David, right? Now, I think the thing here is, like, the worry is second-class citizen. Does that some way denigrate the relationship with Bojidar or make him a second-class citizen? I would say that there's a couple of different things at play here that I'd want to address. The one is this: when we use language like second-class citizen or something like that, obviously the worry is some sort of favoritism or something like that. And admittedly, when we look at those sorts of things, if we really do believe that one child is being favored over another, they're being treated unfairly, they're being treated unjustly, they're not being properly loved or cared for, or something like that, that admittedly and rightly strikes us as repugnant, right? As in some ways undesirable, as unjust, as unfair, as not good. And yet all of those sorts of terms that I just used are moral terms, right? And so these moral terms actually do go to the higher nature. These are things that go to the point of saying like choice, right? Reason and choice. So if you recall, I think I did this in the werewolves, doppelgangers things. I went through anthropology. I talked about the higher and lower nature. And I talked about the fact that the lower nature is your animal nature that has these sort of, animal impulses and things like that. And that animal impulses are not inherently moral or immoral. Your dog can go around humping anything that moves, and that doesn't make it immoral. It's just a dog. But a man does that, right? He's immoral. Why? Because he has reason and free will, right? He has the capacity to assess whether he ought to do that or ought not to do it, and then to engage in it freely. And that's when moral properties actually attach the act. Now, why do I bring that up? Because when we're talking about things like justice and we're talking about fairness, we are actually moving into, and even when we're talking about higher orders of love, like a love that actually identifies what is the good of the person and how do I fulfill that good, right? How do I act in a way that caters to that good? Those are higher order processes. That's not what a dog has, right? So when we're talking about sort of the lower nature, you're actually talking about sort of innate sort of maternal or paternal instincts, right? These sort of animalistic relation that maybe has a protective instinct toward your child or something like that. And admittedly, anybody who has undergone adoption, you recognize that those biological processes are there in ways for your biological children that they might not be there for your adopted children. And I suspect that part of the worry is, well, that's unfair to the child, right? Because the child wants to know that you're as protective of them as you are to your biological children and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that there's nothing virtuous about having a biological impulse to actually sort of move into a protective state with your child. In fact, it can be vicious. Right. So the fact of the matter is that your higher order nature, just like any other passion, has to look and put in check and adjust the sort of lower nature, even in things that we think are pure. This is something that I believe it's in The Great Divorce. There's one point where there's a conversation between a woman who has a clearly distorted love for her child. And it's talking specifically about this issue. And it talks about this sort of like, it's talking about this. It's the person who's critiquing, right? This woman is actually identifying the fact that she has disordered love, and she insists like a mother's love could never be distorted, right? And Lewis rightly points out that that's actually not true. That there's no sort of impulse or biological process or something like that that is strictly speaking pure, right? You share with tigresses the impulse to want to protect your young, something like that. And the fact of the matter is that you, as anybody who also knows as a parent who is engaged in any sort of reflective behavior, you realize that in some ways those paternal or maternal instincts can go wrong. You can, for example, show favoritism. Right. It may be that two children are in an altercation. One of them is yours, and your inclination is to like not want to, treat this other child fairly and judge in favor of your child. That's actually injustice. And so that's an example of your protective instinct actually going wrong, right? In this case. And the higher nature in that case actually should step in and redirect it. You should restrain. If it's, for me, paternal instinct, right? Restrain that paternal instinct and actually correct it, saying you're being unjust and unfair, right? This other kid is actually in the right and your kid is in the wrong. And I know all your protective instincts want to go in favor of your kid, but like that's not true. Now, the reason I bring that up is because I think that when we're talking about second-class citizen or something like that, when we're talking about the sort of love and fairness and care and nurturing and all those sorts of things that a child is due, adopted or biological, those things actually all derive from the higher nature. And in terms of the lower nature, part of the duty of the higher nature is to stoke those and nurture them accordingly. So I know there is, there's, for example, I don't want to go off too far on this tangent, but there is, for example, a tendency sometimes in our culture to sort of treat biological impulses or passions or something like that as if there's no place to restrain or stoke. And so, for example, in terms of sexuality between a married couple, right? There's this tendency to sort of treat things strictly as if, somebody is in the mood for something like that. But again, as Lewis points out, there are certain times when perhaps a person should, out of maternal love and care and duty, I know, dare say duty with regard to sexual things, it's crazy, actually should go ahead and stoke these sort of, the passions with regard to the partner, because this would be the right and good and loving thing to do. And so I think the point of that, the reason I bring that up in this context, is to say that in terms of the higher order of nature, it's entirely in your control. It's entirely an act of will. It's part of the higher nature to decide to show your adopted child and your biological child the same degree of justice, of fairness, of care, of love, of affection, all those things. And if you find that in the lower nature, right, if the concern is to say, well, maybe your child, maybe I just have a more natural affection for my own children because I have a biological tie with them or something like that. Well, if you observe that sort of thing and you identify that as unjust, right, something that you're failing to render to your adopted child what is due, then you should do what you can in order to nurture that, right? Or if there's other sorts of feelings in there that might be sort of negative that you think shouldn't be there, to do all that is in your power in order to, correct those sorts of things. So the point of all that is to say, in terms of like the second class citizen thing, I think most of that is in the category of action, not in ontology. I don't think pretending that somehow Bojidar proceeds from my own, substance, even though he does anything in order to remedy or mitigate a second class citizen status. So the second thing is this. I think there is a tendency in our own culture, and I think this is a misguided sort of compassion, to sometimes try to, in some ways, treat corruptions, abnormalities, tragedies, whatever they are, as if they are not that thing, right? As if somehow by naming them something other than a corruption, as something other than a tragedy, as calling them just different or something like that, that somehow we have done a service to remedying that wrong that's in the world. And I don't believe that's true in the least. I actually think it's a disservice. And this is why. I realize that there is a tendency with somebody like Bojidar, who is delayed, to try to, out of kindness and compassion, to say that there's nothing wrong with him, right? To say that we wouldn't want to say that the cognitive delays that he has and things like that are a corruption. We don't want to use words like abnormal or malformed or any of these sorts of words. They seem too harsh and seem too lacking in compassion and so on and so forth. Putting aside for a moment the metaphysical side of that question of whether or not those terms are the right terms, the fact of the matter is this. Bojidar is mentally and cognitively delayed because of the devil and wicked men. Okay? So the fact of the matter is this. Bojidar has no genetic reason why he should be cognitively delayed right now. The reason he is cognitively delayed is because people chose to nearly starve him to death. That is a product of a fallen world. Humanity has been wounded and energized and taken under the darkness of the devil. And that sort of thing where you nearly starve a child to death is evil. And if you saw the conditions in which, Bojidar was living when we got him, that speaks of the fallenness and the corruption and the evil of our world. If you saw the ways in which he had developed institutional tics of chewing on his tongue because he's starving to death, you would recognize that that's evil. If you saw the patches on his head from where he used to rub his head against a crib because he would just rock to try to self-stimulate because nobody would hold him, you'd recognize that's evil. And so, yes, now that Bojidar has been brought into a family and loved and taken care of, and his body has begun to heal and things like that, we see a very different boy. Yes, that's true. But first of all, I will say this. He still has problems that are problems. They are corruptions. They are things that ought not to be. And also, for all the brightness and goodness and sweetness that is there in this boy who is, mentally delayed, the fact of the matter is that mental delay is the product of having been wounded by the devil and evil men. It is a corruption. And the fact of the matter is that if I desire Bozhidar's good, I should want him to be able to grow into a fully formed, healthy man. And that is something that this side of the resurrection, barring a miracle, I don't anticipate happening for Bozhidar. Now, can beauty and goodness come from that? Of course it can, right? The very fact that our family has been able to take him in and love him has drawn a great good out of this. I've seen the way in which people have been deeply affected by Bozhidar and his story and the way he carries himself. So much good has come out of that. And yes, God excels in drawing good out of evil. But to in some ways say that what Bozhidar endured and what was inflicted upon him was not evil is to insult Bozhidar and what he went through. And so this is where the fact of the matter is, metaphysically speaking, the right words are abnormality, malformed, corruption. That is what happened, right? Bozhidar, properly formed, should be taller than he is. He should be able to speak and to reason and to grow in, cognitive, understanding, learning, make choices, get married, do all sorts of things that he, probably will not be able to do this side of the resurrection. And there is something tragic. Are there beauties and goods that come out of that? Yes. But to try to whitewash those and say, well, it's just different, is to actually, it's not only delusional and divergent from the reality of the matter. It's not just different, it's a corruption. But it's also an insult to what he's been through. And so the fact of the matter is, it is an evil. And those are very real evils that were inflicted upon him. Whatever great good has come out of it, it is an insult to what he's been through in order to just say it's different. Right. And so that's the tendency, I think. I think that sort of thing has to be acknowledged. Now, why do I bring that up? Because there is another tragedy or an evil within the story, which is that Bozhidar was abandoned by his parents. So yes, it is a great good that Bozhidar is being loved and cared for. And all of the, the compassion and the love and the redemption and things like that come out of that story are wonderful, right? Those are goods that God draws out of an evil. But the fact of the matter is that we don't want to whitewash the fact, and we ought not to whitewash the fact, that it is a tragedy that Bozhidar's parents gave him up. It is a tragedy that the people who have a duty to raise him because he is, of their own substance, because he is their son, abandoned him to an orphanage. And that, our family had to step in and rescue him. Now, happy to do it. Glad we did do it. He's a joy. I can't imagine my life without him. But none of that changes the fact that the abandonment of Bozhidar by his parents is a real tragedy. So all that's to say is I think that's an unfortunate tendency in our culture. I don't think it is a service to anyone to go ahead and try to rename tragedies as something other than tragedies, or abnormalities and corruptions as something like is just different. I think that's a disservice to, it's not only, a disservice to reality, but it's also a disservice to the people who have suffered those things, that those are real, genuine corruptions and evils in our world. And that should be acknowledged, even if we're going to acknowledge the sort of complex goods that emerge out of those types of situations. So there you go. That's what I've got on that. Let's see. So that's the last of the most important questions. What do we got here? We've got one under ideology of hell. Okay, what do we got? Can you clarify what you mean when you say that we participate with objects outside of us, though they are distinct from the internal image within us? How can we know we're not deluding ourselves by using the word participate instead of perhaps a word manifest? Okay, so I think there's sort of two different things here that are going on. I'm happy to explain what I was talking about epistemologically here when I was talking. I'm wondering, is this says on the ideology of hell? I talked about that there. I guess I talked about, this almost sounds like what I talked about on Jonathan Peugeot's, my last appearance on Jonathan Peugeot's podcast. But Apparently, I talked about it there as well. So you could actually see, maybe I'll just say, go see my appearance on the Symbolic World, Jonathan Pajot's podcast, where I talk a little bit about this topic, see if that's any additional help to what I'm about to say here. Let me just say one thing first, because again, there is a sub question within this question. So there is a question of like, what does it mean? And then there's this question that is metaphysical or ontological there about participation. And then there's the how do we know, right? And so this is actually a thing that I see come up often. Well, it comes up often in conversations. I've seen it come up often in the comments, and it would probably be worth talking about this at length at some point in a podcast. But I think there's a thing that people will oftentimes confuse epistemology and ontology, like what is versus how you know what is. And oftentimes people will make certain inferences based on that sort of thing. And they'll suggest, well, I don't know what is, therefore it is not, right? Or something like that. And that doesn't follow, right? Things could be a certain way and you might not know it. It wouldn't change that things are that way. And so sometimes people sort of will have a lack of clarity regarding the distinction between epistemology and ontology. And we'll get into a bit of, sort of confused argumentation, right, in one way or another. Not that I'm suggesting this person is confused, but my point is to say that the metaphysical question of what do I mean is different than the question of how do I know, right? Those are two different questions. Okay, so let me just start with, maybe I'll start with the how do I know, because that relates to something that we talked about a little earlier. So first of all, whenever somebody says no, you might want to ask what they mean by no, because this is another area. Epistemology is a dicey area, and sometimes people will conflate all sorts of different things, like how do you know, opinion versus belief versus rational belief versus knowledge versus certainty, all sorts of things. And there's a whole spectrum here. Let me just, rather than say, how do I know, I'll just say why I believe this, right? And so the reason I believe this is because of certain reasons I talked about in the most important question. So I went through epistemology, and I talked about, in terms of epistemology, why I'm a soft foundationalist, right? I critiqued hard foundationalism, I critiqued skepticism, and advocated in there this sort of properly functioning faculties belief, soft foundationalism, my first principles. And then from there, I started to extrapolate realism. And so what I would say is that I think realism, once I have my starting point, my first principle that says, well, whatever I'm going to hold, first of all, I'm not going to start by doubting my faculties like a hard foundationalist or like a skeptic. Instead, I'm going to accept that my faculties are operational, are functional, and they're aimed at telling me true things about the world. I'm going to start there. And so that's going to be my first principle. And then I made the case in that episode, the case for realism. I made the case why realism naturally follows once you say my faculties are properly functioning and aimed at truth-telling. I went through a lot of things there, but I mean, just as an example, I talked about the fact that I think realism is immediately functional. I can't engage in basic perception without differentiating between genera, species, common properties, and so on. That's how you think. That's how you inevitably think. You can't stop thinking that way. Actually, I don't know if I mentioned this quote from Gilson. He's a Thomist. And anyway, he's also a realist for that reason. And it's a great quote, which I think captures really well the sort of inclination toward realism. He said, the first step in convincing somebody of realism is to make them aware that they've always been a realist, right? And this has to do with, obviously all the different things that I've talked about, how, basic perception, basic thought, logic, all those sorts of things presume realism. He said the second step in convincing somebody of realism is to help them to realize that the moment that they cease to play a role in a certain argument, say the role of a nominalist, and go back to living life, they will continue to be a realist. Right? And then the third step is to get them to ask why, right? Why is it that you have always been a realist, that you can't stop being a realist, that the moment you stop arguing with me about nominalism, you'll go back to being a realist? Why is that? Well, maybe it's because realism is true. And so anyway, I went through a variety of things from perception to logic to all those sorts of things we can't do without being realists, right? Without, we think in terms of these general nouns, these groups, these categories. When we reason, we're employing groups and categories. So even if you were to argue with me about realism and argue against realism, you do it using logic, which is to employ groups. So you can't perceive, you can't think, you can't reason without realism, right? So that's one of the reasons I'm a hard-bitten realist. The other thing about it in terms of the perception side of things, what I would say with this is that our sort of basic intuition when it comes to perception is that we have genuine access to the world, that somehow it's not just out there, right? There's something very uneasy and contrary to our intuitions when it comes to solipsism. So once somebody takes a philosophy class for the first time and they engage in the Cartesian experiment and they begin to try to engage in these doubt experiments about whether or not, they're just a brain in a vat, or something like that, or they're in a matrix, or they're being deceived by something or something like that. They grow very uncomfortable. And I think one of the reasons they grow very uncomfortable is because your basic intuition, the ways in which your faculties function, they give you a sense that you do have access to the world. You don't have the impression of being sort of in a container where you wonder whether or not the screens are showing you something out there. The way in which your experience of the world, your perceptions work, they give you an impression that you have the actual access to the things. And there is real access to the things around you, participation in the things around you. And I think realism is the system, and the specific form of realism that I talked about is the sort of best way to account for that sensation that we have, that sense that we have, that we do have access to the world as it is. So what does it mean, right? So this goes to the entire notion of perception that I was talking about. So under realism, and I've been using that term a lot, and as I've been using it, I've realized, this is one of the few episodes where I didn't go through and define the term. Although so many of the questions ask about realism, I presume by this point, folks are catching on. They know what it is. So anyway. Realism, the basic premise of realism is that we all look out into the world. We see basic groups, categories, genera, species, animal, human, bipedal, whatever. And so the question of realism is when we look out and we see these groups, these categories, these sorts of things, common properties, genera, species, is the mind doing that because it's identifying something that is structurally real about the world? And if you say yes, you're a realist. Or is it all just sort of independent, chaotic, idiosyncratic matter? And in an effort to organize all of the chaos, what we do is the mind invents a series of names and imposes them on the world, inventing an organizational structure that's not really there. It's a mental fiction. And if you say that it's a mental fiction, these are just names from nomen, Latin, nomen, you are a nominalist, right? And so obviously, I'm a realist. That's come through here. So one of the central premises of realism then is that these forms or these universals are repeatable, that multiple beings or subjects can participate in them at once, which is why you can have several human persons, right? I participate in humanity and you participate in humanity. These are two instances of human, right? That nature is here and there. Now, the reason that's important, the reason it's important that a generic nature or a common property, a genera or species, can take up residence in multiple places, right? While still maintaining a certain unity to it, right? That I am human, you are human, but the nature of human is still one. The reason that's important is because in terms of perception, that explains how I can somehow actually have access to you and your properties. And this is what I was basically explaining there, right? In what this question is talking about. So within realism, right, you can have, here we have this thing participates in sphericality, and this thing over here participates in sphericality. And one of the realist theories of perception is that what happens in the mind is that when I look at the ball, right, the properties of the ball, let's say it's a red ball. So we'll give it two very basic sets of, two very basic properties, redness and sphericality. When I look at it, that the property of sphericality is abstracted, right? Sphericality now takes up residence in the mind, and redness also takes up residence in the mind. So just like sphericality can be here in this object and here in this object, it can also be here, up here in the mind. And so perception is quite truly abstraction, where when I look at something, the mind is basically abstracting or pulling out of it those universals, and that's the nature of perception. Now, what does it mean that it says like the object is not in my mind, but its properties are? Well, that has to do with the idea that that the object is more than just a set of generic properties. I talked a little bit about hypostasis. If you wanted to go see a longer discussion of the hypostasis doctrine and my particular understanding of the enduring subject, right, the hypostasis, you could go and listen to the werewolves, mummies, and doppelgangers episode. I believe it's in the context of doppelgangers where I talk about the hypostasis doctrine. But suffice it to say that I think the individual, the subject, right, like in the case of my son David, he is a discrete, non-repeatable, ontological, subject that is out there, as it were, external to me. But that subject he has matter, and he has a variety of properties, bipedality, two-armed, 10-fingered, etc. And so when I look on him, the universals, the properties, the forms that he participates in that are within his material, body, also are abstracted and take up residence in my mind. And so in this sense, what's happening is David, the subject that's out there, the existing entity that is out there, does not suddenly take up residence in my mind. But the properties, the generic repeatable properties that he has, those take up residence in my mind by perception. And so that's what I was getting at when I was saying that somehow, what is the phrasing? Could you clarify what you mean when you say that we participate with objects outside of us, though they are distinct from the internal image within us? That's what I was getting at. So David, as a subject, right, the existing enduring entity remains outside of my head, right? But the properties that are within David are repeatable properties. And those properties, what the mind does by perception is it abstracts those so that those properties which are in David are basically repeated or take up residence within my mind, which is what the act of perception is, right? This abstraction of properties. So his properties, the properties that are in him, are also in me, right? It's actually univocal, where the properties that are out there are also in the mind, in my mind, right, by abstraction. But David, the subject, is outside of me. So that's what I was getting at there. Hopefully that's clear and helpful. And like I said, if you wanted to see more on that topic, you could go listen to my interview with Jonathan Peugeot, where I talk about the nature of perception. And I actually talk about it as a sort of a mystical experience, in the sense that as a realist, I believe that the forms are actually, they originate from God. And so perception itself is actually sort of a mystical act participating in the ideas of God. So there's a little teaser. You can go listen to that interview. All right, what do we got here? Let's see. In light of your argument, could you please help me understand the scripture from Jeremiah? It seems to say that God knew him before he was a thing, so to speak. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations. Okay, this is actually a really interesting question. So in the episode, Why Would God Make the Dam? That's actually an audio letter. And so you could go to you can listen to it here. Happy to have you listen to it here. The text version of it, you can also find on my Substack. But basically I went through the Eastern patristic case, and I explored the whole view espoused by John of Damascus, where John of Damascus answers the question, why would God make somebody who he knows will be damned? And he says that God doesn't know that he'll be damned before he chooses to make him. And I went through the logic of that sort of thing, which is to say that unlike a conception where God just sort of looks out into a series of possible worlds or a series of abstract individuals and all these sorts of things, and then picks who he's going to make and all that sort of stuff, these future counterfactuals, what is sometimes called middle knowledge, at least by the Jesuit Molinists and things like that. I think John of Damascus does not think God has hypothetical knowledge like that. And instead, what he believes is even though God has foreknowledge, and this is something from some of the questions that I've seen related to this topic before, I think not everybody is grasping. The Eastern Fathers, people like John of Damascus, do believe that God has foreknowledge of the future. But they think there is a logical order to foreknowledge in the sense that God must first choose to make a world, and in choosing to make that world, now that world is future, and so now it is knowable. In other words, foreknowledge is knowledge of the future, and so there needs to be a future to know. Well, why is there a future? Well, there's only a future to know if God chooses to make a future, right? So that's part of what I was going through with that. So unlike a view where, there's sort of these like future truths floating out there before God ever decides anything, or whether or not God decides anything or something like that, as if these have some sort of truth value on their own. John of Damascus is taking the position that the only reason there is, say, a Jeremiah to know is because God has chosen to make a world, and in that world, in the way that he has chosen to providentially care for it, Jeremiah comes about. And had God not made that choice, there would be nothing, there would be no Jeremiah to know, and there'd be nothing about Jeremiah to know. So in other words, rather than seeing truths, right, about the future or about possibilities or hypotheticals as things that just float in the ether, disconnected from things, the more ancient concept is that possibilities and truths and things like that need to be grounded in reality. And this is actually a really interesting feature, right? A lot of times in contemporary modal logic and argumentation and things like that, people will talk about possibilities in purely semantic ways, right? Like they'll just say, well, like hypothetically, and they'll throw out, a statement. Contemporary modal logic will oftentimes function purely semantically. As long as a statement is free of contradiction, it's possible. But in the ancient world, possibility was thought to require some sort of grounding in reality. It referred to, if you wanted to say that unicorns were possible, that would have to refer in some ways to a combination of a couple of things. One, that there is some sort of potentiality in matter to manifest a unicorn, right? If matter lacked the potential to manifest a unicorn, it wouldn't be meaningful to say a unicorn is possible. It would also have to refer to something like God's power to bring about that manifestation of a unicorn within matter. And so in other words, possibility was not just sort of willy-nilly, sort of like semantic, whatever we throw out into the air, as long as it's free of contradiction or something like that. There was a higher bar of possibility. And so possibility was grounded in reality. And so in the same way, somebody like John of Damascus understands even futurity when you're talking about foreknowledge. God's foreknowledge is of futurities. Well, where do futurities come from? They come from God, right? There is only a world for God to know if God chooses to make a world. So even though his knowledge is of the future, there's still an order to it. He chooses to make a world, and choosing to make a world, now he has knowledge of that world and foreknowledge of its futurities. So there's a certain logical order there. But they still believe in foreknowledge. They just believe that God's choices have to logically precede the knowledge of what comes after those or comes from those choices, if that makes sense. So again, you could see that letter for a more thorough discussion of that. You could also see my appearance on Faith Unaltered. I did a long 2-hour live stream discussion with people specifically on this on this issue. So you can check that out. Now, to this thing about Jeremiah, again, like to my point about what I just said, God having chosen to make a world, and in that world, Jeremiah exists, there actually is something for God to know. So that's not problematic. But there is something very interesting here in terms of what this touches on in the Eastern Church Fathers. And this is the concept of the logoi, right? And so I think I've talked about this. Maybe I talked about this a little bit in my previous Q&A. But there's an interesting feature that in sort of Platonic realism, in most of ancient pagan realism, there was an obsession with generics, right? We just talk about, human, cat, dog, right? When we talk about the forms, we're talking about these sort of strict generics. But one of the things that the Eastern Church Fathers started to recognize and started to explore was this question of saying, well, if we really believe that all things originate from God, that God creates all things, and we start to suggest that the individual actually is a substantive reality, which the hypostasis doctrine, which I touched on earlier, indicates that it is, right? That the individual is not just sort of an odd phenomenon, right? It's not just that you are a sort of, you're just a sort of conglomerate, you're a cluster of various universals, and in this sense, you would hypothetically be repeatable. They thought the individual, the hypostasis, was actually its sort of own discrete reality. It has its own sort of ontological status to it. And so if you're going to say that, and you're going to say that God creates all things, then you're going to have to say that the individual too originates from God. And that raised the natural question of whether or not God has archetypal ideas about individuals, right? And this is where you start to get into one feature of the doctrine of the logoi, right? So the logoi are words, right? So you've heard of the logos, right? The word of God. Logoi is just plural, right? So that's just the words of God. And so on the one hand, you have the Eastern Church Fathers. They will talk about God's, ideas. They'll talk about God's thoughts, right? But they'll also talk about the words of God. And this is, of course, hearkening to Genesis. So Genesis was oftentimes read in a realist way, in which this was seen as a clear proof by Alexandrian Jews and then the Eastern Fathers after them, and also in the Latin West, people like Augustine. It was presumed that, like God, the fact that in Genesis God says, "Let there be," and he names some sort of a generic, right, beast of the field or something like that, that means that God has an idea of the thing he is about to make. And so this was seen as evidence of this sort of notion of archetypal ideas, the realist concept that God has archetypal ideas of the things that he ends up creating. Now, because Genesis was read in that way, that was one of the reasons why every now and then the church fathers would prefer the term logoi, right, over an idea, right, words over ideas, because it's hearkening to Genesis. Now, in the doctrine of the logoi, one of the things that you start to see is this concept that God has archetypal ideas of the individual, that he doesn't just have a generic concept of human, like, yes, he does have a concept of human, but he also has a concept of, Nathan Jacobs, right? He intends to make me, and intending to make me, he actually has an idea of what I ought to become. Now, this is what's sort of interesting here, because on the one hand, you're pointing out a passage here about a righteous man, right? Jeremiah. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, right? Before you were born, I sanctified you. Now, there's another passage that's quite the opposite of this. And this is where, when Christ, in talking about the sheep and the goats, he says, depart from me, I never knew you. Okay. So how are we supposed to put these two things together? And Maximus the Confessor, and I would actually say more subtly, but it's there in St. Anthony before him, the life of St. Anthony, you can see it, written by St. Athanasius, that basically the interpretation of this is that when an individual comes up and they have corrupted and distorted themselves and made themselves something that is unrecognizable to their creator, that what Christ is really saying is, I don't recognize you. Right? Whatever you have made yourself into, it is not what I plotted for you. And so this is interesting, because this is actually part of how predestination is actually interpreted in certain Eastern fathers like John of Damascus, where the presumption is that you and I and every other human being are predestined to a certain type of formation, right? That God has an idea of what you and I are supposed to become. But the difference is that it's not causally efficacious. In other words, what Maximus the Confessor points out is, he says you have this logoi, right? You have this, you have this logos, right? This thing that you are supposed to become, right? This conform to this idea that God has for you. And yet there's also tropos, right? This movement, right? A mode of action. And the logos is just like with any other archetype, determines whether your mode of action is moving you toward or away from that. So just like if we had a square, And it's, well, let's say, we've got a triangle, and the points aren't quite an equal distance from a common century. If we start to move the points closer to that equal distance, we're moving it toward proper formation. We start to scatter them about, we're moving it away from that, right? So the archetype is determining whether or not the motion and the change is in keeping, moving it toward or away from proper formation. And Maximus Confessor says the same sort of thing when it's talking about you and me, right? That we have this certain mode of activity that relative to our logos, the logos determines whether that mode of activity is moving us toward proper formation or away from it, right? Whether it's corruption or it's well-being. And the idea here is that underwrites this idea that that is the predestined end, right? That is your predestined end. That is my predestined end, to be a saint. And in the case of somebody like Jeremiah, right, he has been called and ordained to be this, and Jeremiah is responsive to that, right? He ends up actually moving into the mode of being that he moves into. He actually does step into that role and moves in accord with his logos. But at the same time, amongst the sheep and the goats, right? Christ actually identifies plenty of people who did not move in that direction. And so I never do you, right? Your self-determination moved you contrary to what God made you to be. So anyway, that's part of what sits there underneath it. So on the one hand, in terms of like the entire theory of knowledge, of course, God has knowledge of Jeremiah because he's chosen foreknowledge of Jeremiah because he's chosen to make a world in which Jeremiah exists. As for, this specific calling and setting apart and ordaining and these sorts of things, I'd identify this as having to do with the Logos doctrine or the Logoi doctrine that you see in the Eastern Fathers. Okay, how are we doing on time? I think we still have time for some more. Let's look at this next question. Given, this is also, why would God make the damned? Given the classical view of free will, that freedom is acting in accord with our teleology rather than freedom in modernity being something like the ability to act arbitrarily. I wonder how you view the patristic universalist tradition. Sin is slavery, and Christ wasn't less free for not being capable of sin. Do you believe that it is possible that if one were able to grasp the summum bonum, the highest good, our teleological end, they could, in theory, decide not to choose it, or that the eschatological reality of God being all in all could leave out part of the creaturely Sophia, the body of Christ? Okay, there's like 15 questions in this one question, so I can't actually answer them all. But here's what I can do. Is I'll touch on a few different things. So first of all, in terms of universal salvation, I would point you to my Substack. So there actually is a piece called, on apokatastasis. Just look for that word if you're not familiar with it. I have the audio letter version of it. So the read version, the audio version, and I also have the text version. And I offer my own assessment and of that topic, and I lay bare my cards on that topic and whether or not I advocate for universal salvation. I'm not even going to tell you. You got to go to Substack. You got to read it for yourself if you're curious. Okay, in terms of the question of Christ and this whole thing about Christ not being less free for not being capable of sin, I also have in my Substack a letter on the question of whether or not Christ could sin, and here being the nomic will question. And so I walk through that whole topic and offer some clarity on that with Maximus. But I do think there's a couple of other conflations happening here. So it suggests actually that I want to actually talk about the first part. So given the classical view of free will, that freedom is acting in accord with our teleology rather than freedom in the modern sense of being like the ability to act arbitrarily. I think that's actually a mischaracterization. So I've heard this sort of thing that, floating about on the internet, which I think needs some correction. And so I've heard that some folks are like, well, I know that we talk about free will today, like it has something to do with contrary choice, what here is being identified as act arbitrarily. arbitrarily from arbitrium would be choice, right? But I think they mean sort of like willy-nilly or indifferently, or it could be otherwise, I think is what the characterization here. And so I've heard this critique before where they're like, well, and people like Augustine or, in the church fathers generally, real freedom is not, the power of contrary choice. Real freedom actually does have to do with, it has to do with righteousness. And so operating in accord with the good, that's true freedom. And so then they go on and suggest that freedom shouldn't be defined as the capacity to do otherwise. Okay, so that's not true. Okay, so do you actually find rhetorically, people like Augustine or others who will rhetorically actually say things like that operating in accord with the good is true freedom and sin is not true freedom and things like that? Yes, of course, they do say things like that, that sort of acting on your passions and behaving viciously is not true freedom, and that true freedom, operating in the good and doing those sorts of things, righteousness, that's true freedom. Yes, you find those rhetorical statements. But you also find in the very same people a very clear sense that freedom involves the power of contrary choice. So Augustine, for example, in City of God, Book 5, where he's dealing with Cicero is raising a worry from the foreknowledge problem. And this is on his treatise on divination. And Cicero is worried that, look, if foreknowledge is true and God foreknows our choices, and that means our choices can't be otherwise, then that means we're determined. And if we're determined and we can't do otherwise, then we wouldn't be responsible for our choices. How do we hold people justly accountable? How do you say that this person is morally culpable for doing this thing when they couldn't do otherwise, right? And that's Cicero's concern. And that's why he doesn't like the concept of divination and foreknowledge. Sees it as a problem for justice. Now, what's interesting is Augustine does not do what contemporary compatibilistic determinists might do. He, first of all, doesn't say, well, Cicero, what you have to understand is that free will is not actually the capacity to do otherwise. And free will, real free will, has to do with, doing the good. And therefore, right, even though our choices are determined, it doesn't really, he doesn't do that. He also doesn't do what a contemporary compatibilist determinist would do. So compatibilism is the notion that somehow free will and determinism is compatible. And how compatibilists do this is they do a similar tactic to this. They're like, well, we shouldn't define free will as the power of contrary choice. We should define free will as doing whatever it is you desire to do without coercion. And so even if we're determined, as long as we're not coerced, we're free, right? That's sort of the compatibilist tactic. And incidentally, people get confused because they sometimes think compatibilism means, remedying some theological paradox where the sovereignty of God, and the free will of man are reconciled, right? That God is somehow sovereign and yet it is compatible with our freedom. That's not what it means. It means determinism and freedom are compatible if you redefine freedom to mean no contrary choice. I always find that a little weird. It's like, saying look, man, square and triangle are perfectly compatible if we just redefine square to mean three-sided. So that's basically what it does. So the point of saying that is to say that what you find in Augustine is in his response to Cicero, if he were a compatibilist, he could have very easily said, well, Cicero, it's true that we can't do otherwise, but freedom properly defined is just about doing it without coercion. So it's not a problem. He doesn't do that. He also doesn't do the alternative version of that, saying, well, freedom, Cicero, is not really about contrary choice. Freedom has to do with, it has to do with the good. He doesn't do that. Everything that he argues in Book 5 has to do with defending the idea that foreknowledge does not hinder your ability to do contrary choice. He ends up arguing that what foreknowledge means is it creates a genuine subject-object relationship of free causes, of self-determining causes and things like that. So anyway, Augustine clearly does think that freedom involves contrary choice. and that there is genuine moral responsibility. His whole thing with regard to grace, whenever he talks about prevenient grace, it's the same sort of thing. He wants to say that there's no deficiency in the grace that was given, like in the case of Adam, or even when he talks about prevenient grace. He talks about there's no deficiency in the grace given. The grace was, sufficient for you to go ahead and do the good. And so if it was cast off, it was cast off freely, and that falls entirely to the creature, right? So he doesn't have a mechanistic view of this, right? He actually does have the view and the creature has the ability to choose in accord with the grace, but also to cast it off. And that's exactly why it falls to the creature if they decide to cast off the grace. And again, you see this sort of thing all over the place in the Eastern Fathers, where they insist that moral culpability requires two things: knowledge to do what you ought to do, and the ability to do it or not do it. Again, yes, they do believe that the entire purpose of freedom, right? Freedom, if it is properly used, should move toward the good, right? And they also, in terms of God, right, they don't think there's something deficient in the fact that God is, I don't even want to say incapable, but that God's goodness is complete such that he would never do evil, right? And so this is the sort of thing with what's called the nomic will in Maximus the Confessor, which is a term that evolves over time for Maximus. But the point, what he's suggesting is that no, Christ, can't sin. However, it is true also that God has free choice. And so you see this very clearly in the Cappadocians, in John of Damascus, in Maximus the Confessor, that just because God's choices would never move into evil, they don't deny that he doesn't have contrary choice. John of Damascus says very explicitly that God can clearly do things that he doesn't do, such as destroy the world right now. So he makes choices. It's just that being good, none of his choices would ever involve evil. Right. And so I think this is one of the things that's sort of very strange about this way of thinking, that sometimes there is a tendency to suggest that because God is incapable of evil or would only do good, that means there's only one thing he would do and that there's no choice involved. That doesn't follow at all. There are a host of good choices that you can make. And so the Eastern Fathers do believe that God is categorically, it's incompatible with the divine nature, that God would ever do something that's corrupt or evil. But they also believe that God has genuine choice, right? So they do actually advocate for that. And similarly, even with creatures, yes, they don't think it's actually a good thing that we can do evil. They think it's inevitable, sort of like it's sort of a metaphysical entailment of our creatureliness and finitude that we're capable of moving in retrograde ways. And they don't think that's a superior power, right? God is superior to us in the fact that he can't move in retrograde ways. The fact that we can sin is actually indicative of our finitude and our corruptibility. That's true. So it's not an elevated power. But do they think the power of contrary choice and freedom of self-determination and things like that is actually an elevated power? They do. Basil of Caesarea says explicitly that if God didn't have free choice, how could we, right? Because it's an elevated power, and that would mean we have some perfection that God doesn't have. So the Eastern Fathers clearly do think we have contrary choice. So even though they want to say that like true freedom, if you're talking about true freedom, is not to engage in, vices and be bound by sin, and they rhetorically make that move that true freedom is found in holiness and goodness and virtue and things like that. They're not saying, and therefore involves no power of contrary choice. That's not what's going on there. So I've heard this sort of thing used as a way to try to dismiss the contrary choice thing as if that's not a feature of the ancient view of freedom. That's not true. It very much is part of their view of freedom that we have contrary choice. Now, I do think there are oddities and shifts that happen in the contemporary discussion of free will. And I talk about this a lot in my upcoming Leibniz book. I'm going to do probably a whole episode, not probably, I'll do a whole episode on free will, at least one episode coming up on free will at one point. So I'll talk more detail about that later. But I will say, yes, the contemporary discussion of free will does end up going in odd directions. The very fact that you have advocates of determinism is a little bit weird. Like most people wanted to avoid determinism in the ancient world. The fact that you have people trying to reconcile determinism with freedom, right? Soft determinist or compatibilist. That's weird. Historically speaking, that's really odd. You have certain oddities emerging thanks to the Jesuits, Spanish Jesuits, where they're defining free will. And I think this is kind of what you're referring to as arbitrary. They're defining free will as like this absolute spontaneous indifference that has no preferences or whatever, right? Like where it's borderline random. Also weird, historically speaking. And that's actually one of the things that really confuses the discussions around Leibniz and so on. So I think there's a host of things that happen in the free will discussion that are rather odd and put us in an odd place. But one of the things that is not odd is that people think that freedom means that I actually face a series of choices and I have a genuine capacity to choose to do otherwise. And that capacity to do otherwise, if I do something, if I choose P, and it's impossible that I choose not P, right? That in some way that undermines my freedom. That intuition that says that I genuinely could do otherwise, I face real choices, and even though I chose this, I could have chosen that. That intuition is not unusual. That goes way back into the ancients, and it's ubiquitous in the church fathers. And so, yes, do they think engaging in vice and being bound by the passions is freedom? No, they think that's a mode of enslavement. But in saying that, are they saying that you don't have the power of contrary choice? Absolutely not. In fact, they think the reason you can make different choices about whether to be enslaved to your passions is because you do have contrary choice. So anyway, we'll do a much larger discussion on that topic later. As for, like I said, the universalist stuff and things like that, you can see my Substack, Christ and Sin, and Maximus the Confessor. You can see my Substack on that. Okay, so let's see, what do we got? Let's see if we can move through the last of these pretty quick. As far as ethics go, I'd be interested to see how you might answer the trolley problem. Okay, let's try to do this really rather quickly. So the trolley problem, for those who are unfamiliar, let's say that you are stuck on a train. It's out of control. It's racing down the tracks. It's been rigged by a madman so that you can't, there are no brakes or whatever. So you are just stuck in this car that's racing down the tracks, and he is also tied to the tracks. There's a fork in the road up ahead, like split in the tracks. And over here, there's 5 people tied to the tracks that he's, tied down to it. And over here, there's 1 person, tied to the tracks over here. And the only thing that you can control, right? This thing is racing, barreling down these tracks. The only thing you have control over is this lever. And this lever will determine whether or not which way the train tracks go. So the current track that you're on, it's set to kill the 5 people. If you pull the lever, it's going to go over here and kills the 1 person. So what do you do? Do you pull the lever or do you not pull the lever? The answer, quite simply, is you pull the lever. I know that people will probably be like, gas, but you kill the lever, but you pulled the lever, but you just killed a person, right? So this is where the doctrine of double effect is actually really useful. So the doctrine of double effect is sort of like a medieval principle of ethics. It's basically this principle that says, like, no, you are absolutely not allowed to engage in evil means in order to get good ends, right? You can't do that, right? But there is a circumstance in which you are permitted to engage in evil. And that's if evil attaches to all of the choices that, you face, which this trolley problem is the quintessential example of a scenario in which that's the case. If evil attaches to all the choices that you face, then in order to minimize the evil and prevent greater evils, or to minimize evil, something like that, actually is to have a good object in mind, right? In terms of the action that you're engaged in. So in this case, the fact of the matter is the inaction of not pulling the lever actually is a form of action. I'll come back to that in a second. But so there is no sort of like whatever choice. If you make the affirmative choice, I'm not going to pull the lever, you actually are choosing the outcome that 5 people die. You choose to pull the lever. You are also choosing action, but here 1 person dies. And so in both cases, evil attaches, right? You are involved in the death of people. But the fact of the matter is you have a very clear choice in terms of which one is going to minimize the evil that has attached to all the choices that you face. So under the doctrine of double effect, the obvious choice is that you pull the lever. Now you might say, well, no, there's a difference though between like just not pulling the lever isn't an action. And here, since we're doing medieval ethics, you can sort of differentiate between like volo, nolo, and non-volo. And so this is sort of a Scotistic distinction, John Duns Scotus, where he talks about, like, yes, there is action, right, affirmative action. And then there is like, I will to do this. There is, I will not, right, which actually is an affirmative act, right? It is an act of will to say, I won't do that. And then there's like sort of, I don't will, right? Which is that sort of like the will hasn't moved. So yes, so to hesitate, right, to pull the lever, you are not yet in a form of action, right? That's the point where you haven't willed. But the fact of the matter is, in the situation, you know that inaction will result in a choice of a certain kind. You are choosing the other one. So I don't think the idea of inaction is actually available to you. At some point, inaction, indecision at this point actually becomes a decision, because you know there is a very quickly approaching, terminus of you better choose, right, one way or another. And to not choose is to, permit the one course of action that includes the greater evil. So yeah, you pull the lever. Doctrine of double effect. Okay, what else do we got? I think we only have, let's see, 2 more questions. Is it possible for realism and nominalism to both be correct, like a dialectic where if you're at a certain viewpoint, they both apply? I don't think so. And this question has come up a couple of different times, I think. And maybe, again, I could do a longer episode with all these things. If you're like, please do an episode on that, just put it in the comments. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible to thread that needle. And here's why. I think it either falls into, I think whenever people try to avoid realism and sort of do this, like it's not realism, or it's kind of realism and it's kind of nominalism, it's both. I think ultimately behind the scenes, they have one or the other. I think this really is a binary choice. So for example, let's say somebody is like, well, I think we do have realist structures, but these are sort of inventions that God imposes out there, and they're sort of like at a created level. And so there's a sense in which they're part of the fabric of reality, but God is above and beyond those sorts of things and things like that. The problem is once you start pressing certain questions on whether or not, these rules in any way apply to God, what you start to find pretty quick is that people will start to talk in ways that the rules are not just created rules. Let me give you an example. So realists have a tendency to think that there are certain moral boundary lines with regard to reality, that, for example, like murder has an inherent wrongness to it. Realists tend to be like natural law ethicists, for example. And so they want to say that, yes, there are things that God can impose and you have a duty to do because he's God and you have a natural obligation to him. Like he can tell you don't wear, garments made out of 2 different types of fabric, and all of a sudden you have a duty to do that, not because there's an inherent wrongness to it, but because God told you to do it. But things like, rape or murder have certain inherent wrongness to it given the order of nature. And so they want to say that, like, there's some things that God commands that where he's just declaring and commanding you to act in accord with the order of nature that he's created. And then there are other things that are just sort of like divine commands that have to do with desiring your obedience and are in some ways somewhat arbitrary. They could be otherwise. And so the problem is, if you're a true nominalist and you don't think these structures are inherently real, one of the things that realists tend to press sometimes is like, so could God make, and then they start to go, press something like, could God make, raping or murdering or torturing infants for fun morally upright, right? Because there's no inherent structural, wrongness to them. And oftentimes what people will try to do is they'll grow uncomfortable because they're like, I don't know, man, I think maybe torturing infants for fun is probably like inherently problematic. And so they're like, well, like he could, but he wouldn't, right? And they'll start to do that sort of thing where they're trying to have it both ways. Like they want to say that God has the power to do it, but he would never do it. But the problem is if you say, well, he would never do it, why not, right? Is there some sort of structure that applies even to God that suggests that somehow that would be a bad thing for him to do? And in that sense, if you start to make that sort of distinction, you actually sort of do have a realism behind your realism. Supposedly realism is down here for us, but somehow it's back here for God. So you're suggesting that there actually is some sort of structure there, some sort of structure to goodness itself, that God will operate in accord with. The other problem that you start to run into is I'm not even sure what that distinction means, right? So if you're going to say that God could, and you say he has like the raw power to do it or something like that, but he would never do it because he's good, right? You run into this problem that I'm not even sure what it means to say that he could, right? Because you're just sort of talking about maybe sort of some sort of abstract quantity of force or something like that. I'm not sure there's an actual like sort of meaningful exposition of what those terms mean. So in other words, I think what starts to happen is when you start to say that God could, but he wouldn't. But candidly, I'm not even sure what that means to say that he could, but he wouldn't. Because if what you're going to say is that somehow God's goodness is such that it never would manifest or operate in this way, or it's incompatible with that, I'm not sure what the could means, right? Because you're actually saying that there's something essential to his nature that makes that course of action impossible. So in what sense, what does it mean to say that it's possible, that it's also not possible? Also, the other problem is, I think under nominalism, what it means to say that God is good, I think it candidly becomes meaningless. I think God becomes beyond good and evil. Because what you really start to say in a nominalist framework is that good and evil are really sort of down here for us. And whatever God determines them to be actually is good. Right, for example. But clearly that's not the Christian view. We tend to actually suggest that God is the good. And so that his expressions, how he expresses himself articulates that nature through the divine energies, is reflective of and is an extension of that underlying goodness. But if there is no innate underlying structure to goodness and the order of nature and reason and things like that, then I'm not even sure what these buffers are that we're talking about with regard to the nature of God. So anyway, all that's to say is that I think the answer is no. I don't think, I think they're mutually exclusive. And I think whenever people have tried to sort of thread that needle, what they ultimately end up doing is they start by trying to produce a realism of sorts down here for us and say that God is somehow above that. But when you start to ask the uncomfortable questions about the ramifications of God being beyond that, you suddenly start to see certain rules and structures of goodness and rationality and logic and things like that that are somehow governing God's decisions up here, right? That are somehow woven into or reflective in God's decisions. In other words, they end up trying to sort of put realism down here at the creaturely level and make God above that. But before you know it, you start asking certain questions about why God does that. And all of a sudden the structures of reason and goodness start to, make their way up to the transcendent level to make sure we don't say blasphemous things about God. So anyway, I don't think there's any way of threading that needle. I think they are mutually exclusive, and I think it's evident which one is true, which is realism. All right. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, let me take a look at what it is, and then we'll see, we'll wrap this up. So on belief in fairies, this one. Humans are said to have human nature, and because we share this human nature, there's a distinct humanness shared by us all that is expressed uniquely in each individual human, but surely we identify the human nature based on the common properties that we all share. But if this is the case, I fail to see why we don't have a bipedal nature and a two-eyed nature and a haired nature and whatever else. Okay. So the answer here is actually yes. Our nature is what's called a complex nature. So if you've ever heard this term like simplicity, right? Divine simplicity, one of the things that it means, and it means more than this, you can see my interview with David Bradshaw where we talk a little bit about this. But the contrast between God's simple nature and our nature is that question of, the fact that we have a complex nature. And so a complex nature simply acknowledges that when you're talking about certain types of things, they have a variety of components to them. So when we talk about a square, right, we talk about sides, right? We talk about the number 4. We talk about right angles. Those are all distinct things. So there are right angles that are not squares, right? And so that is its own distinct type of form. So when you're talking about a square, even though it seems like a very simple thing, it's actually quite complex. It consists of a variety of forms. And the presumption is that there actually is a form of square, right? That is a meaningful thing. That is a form, but that form is sort of a governing form, right? A complex form that holds together, right? All of these different forms. Now, the thing is, the same thing is true of us, right? We have bipedal, 10-fingered, two-eyed, et cetera. And in fact, presumably our nature is exceedingly complicated, right? As Basil of Caesarea once said, there's a lot of tubes in there. And so the very fact that natures can overlap in this way, that they can be shared in this way, complex natures, that's what makes it meaningful to talk and think terms of like genera and species and common properties, right? Animal, right? This is actually a nature, right? A certain type of thing, a certain type of form. But within that, and then you have these sort of subforms, right? These other complex natures of certain types of animals. And then you have common properties that certain animals share, like bipedal, for example. And so this is actually one of the things that Plato ends up concluding once he starts looking at the forms. What he realizes is that the forms are never sort of insulated from each other, but they're actually shared across creation. This is one of the things that leads him to the conclusion that the world of the forms, right, the forms ultimately connect together to make a cosmos. So in Plato's Timaeus, right, his creation myth, he ultimately introduces this character called the absolute living being. And when you explore, well, what the heck is that guy, right? Well, you realize is that the absolute living being is all of the forms, right? It's all of the archetypes or the forms, conjoined together that form one thing. And what's that thing? The cosmos, right? And so when Plato looks at the world, he sees the world as one giant complex nature in which there are an infinite number of sort of sub-natures that work together like a giant organism. And what's interesting is you do see similar concepts like that in the Eastern Church Fathers. This is actually related to the man as microcosm doctrine, and where I said, like, I actually do see certain aspects of evolution that if it were true, I would think would, cohere well with certain aspects of Eastern patristic thought that would be related to this whole thing. But suffice it to say that, like, yes, people like Plato actually do see our world as one giant living organism, which is something I also touched on actually in the demons context, right? That God makes a certain world structure, and that world structure has to be cared for in a certain way. And just because a certain part becomes cancerous, like the demon, he doesn't just rip it out. All that's to say is that you are quite right to recognize that, yes, there is a nature of eye, and there is a nature of bipedal, and there is a nature of liver, and there is a nature of soul, right? And things like that. And all of these sorts of things actually do overlap and interconnect. And so when you're talking about a species like human, yes, we have a complex nature that holds that together. Now, the other things you're talking about is the distinction between essential and accidental properties, right? So the color of my skin, my height, things like that, those are accidental. And this is where you get into things like what's internal versus external, like what is sort of like in my material, right? Material accidents versus what is internal to my nature. That's kind of what I was hinting at when I was talking about some of the evolution stuff. And as much as these conversations may seem like highly abstract and a little bit weird, sometimes where you're like, this is super like fine-tuned metaphysical minutia, they do end up having ramifications. So like one of the Christological disputes, such as between Nestorius and Cyril, ultimately does come down to this really fine point of metaphysics, because Nestorius, who wants to in some ways insulate the two natures of Christ, that he's divine and human. He's worried that if you conjoin two natures together, right, humanity and divinity, you end up getting a new species of thing, right? Like it's quite literally what Nestorius is worried about, which is why he thinks you need two separate subjects, right? Two persons, two prosapa, who sort of insulate each nature, and then the persons are somehow like hinged together or glued together so that you preserve the integrity of those. Whereas somebody like Cyril of Alexandria is saying, what are you talking about? We have all the time a person who has multiple natures, and he actually appeals to complex nature. He talks about, and he uses the analogy of the nature of my soul is very different than the nature of my body. I have them both. It's my body and it's my soul, but they don't mingle together. And that's the sort of analogy you might use to explain how Christ can have two natures, a human nature, which is very complex, and a divine nature, and yet they don't mingle or get confused into something, even though they're had by the same subject. So as much as these sorts of fine points of metaphysics may seem a little peculiar and like, why would you engage in those? They do end up having massive ramifications within the history of ideas. And so maybe on that note, it's a good point to wrap up. So keep on viewing, keep on liking, keep on subscribing, keep on sharing, keep on leaving those comments, and I'll keep on answering your questions. So there you go. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Nathan Jacobs Podcast.